Picture this. Rain falls sideways across a hillside in northern England. Not the gentle rain of spring planting or autumn harvest. This rain drives horizontal, cold as malice, mixing with something else now, something warm. The mud beneath 10,000 boots has turned the colour of rust. A man slips, goes down on one knee, and when he rises his palm is coated not in earth, but in the pulped remains of someone's face. He doesn't scream. He's past screaming. He simply wipes his hand on his sodden surcoat and keeps moving forward, because forward is the only direction left. Behind him, the screams do the work his throat has forgotten. The sound is what survivors remember longest. Not the clash of steel, that comes later, in nightmares, in the quiet moments before sleep. No, it's the sucking, the wet, obscene sound of the earth drinking, boots pulling free from mud that doesn't want to let go, bodies settling into ground that opens for them like a lover, and beneath it all, the rhythm of metal finding flesh, a butcher's percussion that hasn't stopped for 2 hours and won't stop for 2 more. The smell reaches half a mile. Blood has a smell when there's enough of it. Copper and salt and something sweetly rotten underneath, like fruit left too long in summer heat. Men vomit and keep fighting. Men soil themselves and keep fighting. Men watch their brothers fall and keep fighting because stopping means joining them in the mud that has become a mass grave. Somewhere in the chaos a banner still flies. The red lion rampant of Scotland, torn now, sagging on its pole but visible. And beneath it, surrounded by the dead and the dying, a man fights on. He has taken wounds that would kill most men twice over. His left hand is a ruin of shattered bone where an English bill hooked through his gauntlet. An arrow shaft protrudes from his jaw, the head lodged somewhere near his throat. Blood sheets down his armour, mixing with the rain, pooling in the joints until his movements make wet clicking sounds. Still he fights, still he pushes forward. Because this man does not know how to do anything else. He is James IV, King of Scotland. He is 40 years old. By nightfall he will be a corpse so mutilated that identification requires the testimony of those who knew him intimately. By morning, his body will be in English hands. By the following year, his head will be separated from his shoulders, his remains left unburied for decades, his kingdom shattered, his heir an infant, his legacy reduced to a single word that Scots will whisper for 500 years. Flodden! But that comes later. Right now, the King of Scotland is still alive, still fighting, still believing that courage and will can overcome what is happening around him. They cannot. Historians still debate whether James understood in those final moments what his choices had cost. Whether the king who prided himself on being a warrior, who insisted on leading from the front, who charged into English lines when every tactical principle demanded retreat, whether he realised that his courage had become his people's death sentence. We will never know what passed through his mind as the English bills rose and fell around him, as his bodyguard died one by one, as the banner above him finally toppled into the mud. What we know is this: Scotland brought the largest army it had ever assembled to an English field. Nearly 30,000 men crossed the border in September 1513. Fewer than 10,000 walked home. The rest stayed, in the mud, in the rain, in earth that would yield bones and armour fragments for centuries. This is not a story of English triumph. It is not a story of Scottish failure. It is a story of how one man's virtues became his vices, how strength became weakness, how a golden age ended in an afternoon of slaughter so complete that it would take Scotland a generation to recover. How does a king lead his nation's finest to their graves and die believing he did everything right? The story begins with a murder, June 1488, Saushyburn, Scotland. A 15-year-old boy watches his father's army break against rebel forces. King James III, aloof, intellectual, despised by his nobility, flees the battlefield on a horse too fast for his skill. He is thrown, injured, taken to a nearby mill where he begs for a priest. A man enters. He claims to be a priest. James III makes confession, receives absolution, prepares to meet his God. Then the false priest draws a knife and opens the king's throat. The rebels win. The 15-year-old boy becomes James IV, and for the rest of his life he will carry a secret beneath his royal robes, an iron chain wrapped around his waist, biting into his flesh, adding links with each passing year. Penance for the sin of patricide. He did not wield the knife, but he rode with the rebels. His victory cost his father's life. The chain will stay until the day he dies. This is the first thing to understand about James IV. His entire reign was an act of atonement. Everything that came after, the justice, the magnificence, the obsessive personal courage, grew from the soil of his father's blood. Historians still debate whether the young king's transformation was genuine spiritual conversion or calculated political theatre. The answer may be both. Within months of taking the throne, James began constructing a monarchy his father could never have imagined. Where James III trusted scholars and musicians over nobles, James IV made himself a warrior king. Where his father hid in Edinburgh, James IV travelled constantly, the Highlands, the Western Isles, the borders, showing himself to subjects who had never seen a king in person. Where James III accumulated enemies through arrogance, James IV accumulated friends through charm, and he had charm in abundance. Contemporary accounts describe a man who could speak 6 languages fluently, who pulled his own subjects' teeth when they couldn't afford a barber surgeon, who competed in tournaments against his own knights, who danced until dawn and still rose for morning mass. He could discuss theology with bishops, navigation with sea captains, warfare with veterans, poetry with scholars. Women found him irresistible. He fathered at least 6 illegitimate children before his marriage, and remained notorious for romantic entanglements throughout his reign. But beneath the glitter, the chain dug deeper every year. James IV built obsessively, ambitiously, expensively. The Great Michael, largest worship in Europe, took most of Scotland's oak forest to complete. Holyrood Palace rose from medieval ruins into Renaissance splendour. The College of Surgeons received its royal charter. The printing press arrived in Edinburgh. For 25 years, Scotland experienced something it had rarely known: competent governance, relative peace, growing prosperity. The king's justice became legendary. He personally attended court sessions, hearing cases from commoners who would never have reached his father's presence. He issued safe conducts for peasants to bring complaints against their lords. He hanged nobles who violated the peace, actually hanged them, not merely threatened. And Scotland's endemic blood feuds began, finally, to cool. The European powers noticed. Where Scotland had been a backwater, a minor piece on the continental chessboard, James IV made it matter. He negotiated as an equal with France, with Spain, with the Pope himself. In 1503 he achieved what Scottish kings had sought for generations: peace with England, sealed by marriage to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII. That marriage changed everything. Margaret was 13 when she crossed the border. James was 30. The wedding celebrations lasted weeks. Tournaments, feasts, pageants that drained the treasury and dazzled foreign observers. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace that accompanied it promised an end to centuries of border warfare. James received an English princess. England received Scottish neutrality. It should have been the capstone of a golden reign. But chains have a way of tightening. James had spent 25 years becoming everything his father was not. Brave where James III was cowardly, present where his father was absent, a warrior where his father was a scholar. The one thing he had not examined was whether his father's caution might, in certain circumstances, be wisdom rather than weakness. James IV feared being perceived as weak more than he feared death itself. When the test came, that fear would kill him and 17,000 of his people. The summer of 1513 approached. Across the narrow sea, the great powers were moving toward war, and Scotland's golden king would discover that perpetual peace, like most things promised by treaties, was a lie with an expiration date. The letter arrived in spring. Anne of Brittany, Queen of France, wrote with the practiced hand of a woman who had survived 2 kings and learned to weaponize femininity. She addressed James as her knight, her champion, her defender. She enclosed a ring from her own finger, a turquoise set in gold, and 14,000 French crowns to fund a war she needed him to fight. The message was clear. France calls upon Scotland's ancient friendship. England has invaded our soil. Honour demands you draw their forces north. James held the ring in his palm, weighed it, considered what it meant. The Old Alliance, the treaty binding France and Scotland against their common English enemy, was nearly 200 years old. It had served both nations well. When England pressed France, Scotland could threaten from the north, forcing English kings to divide their armies. When England punished Scotland, France provided money, weapons, and the possibility of a second front. The arrangement worked because it cost little. Scots died for French interests. French gold funded Scottish resistance. Neither nation trusted the other. Both found the arrangement useful, but usefulness has limits. Henry VIII had crossed the Channel that summer with the largest English army in a generation. 25,000 men marched toward France, commanded by the young king himself, leaving England nearly defenceless. The opportunity was obvious. France's enemies were distracted. Scotland's traditional prey lay exposed. Every strategic calculation pointed toward invasion. And yet, historians still debate whether James IV truly wanted this war or felt trapped by circumstances he had failed to anticipate. The evidence suggests both. His letters to Henry VIII in the months before the invasion reveal a man searching for an excuse not to fight. He complained about English attacks on Scottish shipping, about border violations, about insults to his honour. Each complaint offered Henry a chance to apologise, to offer compensation, to give James a reason to stay home. Henry ignored them all. The English king was 22 years old, drunk on his own magnificence, utterly convinced that his uncle by marriage would not dare attack while he conquered France. Henry was wrong, but not entirely. James summoned his nobles to Edinburgh. The response exceeded all expectations. This would be a feudal levy on a scale Scotland had never attempted. Not merely border lords with their mounted raiders, but the full strength of the kingdom. Highland chiefs brought clansmen who had never seen the lowlands. Burgesses from Edinburgh and Aberdeen marched alongside peasant levies from Fife and Angus. The church contributed funds, prayers, and a papal banner blessing the invasion as a holy cause. By late August, nearly 30,000 men had gathered, the largest Scottish army ever assembled. James inspected his forces with visible pride. He had spent years building this moment. The artillery train alone represented decades of investment, including 17 great guns that could shatter castle walls. The French had sent advisors, gold, and a contingent of professional soldiers. The pikemen had trained in the Swiss fashion, learning the push-of-pike tactics that dominated European battlefields. Scotland was no longer a nation of raiding cavalry and feudal chaos. This was a modern army, capable of fighting any force in Christendom. Also, James believed, the King's Council was not unanimous. Some lords urged caution. England was weakened but not helpless. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, remained in the north with whatever forces he could muster. A warden of the marches, old and experienced, he would not be easily surprised. Others pointed to the approaching autumn, to the difficulty of supplying such a massive force, to the political complications of an extended campaign. James listened. He didn't hear. The chain beneath his robe seemed lighter that summer. He was finally truly the warrior king his people needed. He would prove himself on an English field as his ancestors had dreamed of doing for centuries. He would make Scotland great in a way his murdered father could never have imagined. On August 22nd, the army crossed the border. What James could not know, what no one could know, was that the instrument of his destruction was already moving. An old man with a body wrecked by gout was climbing onto a horse, gathering every soldier he could find, and riding north with a single thought burning in his mind. The Howards owed the Tudor dynasty everything. They would pay that debt in Scottish blood. The castles fell like rotting teeth. Norham first, the great fortress that had defied Scottish armies for generations. James's artillery battered its walls for 5 days, the guns roaring from dawn until darkness made aiming impossible. The smell of gunpowder settled over the siege camp, mixing with the stench of latrines and unwashed men. When the walls finally collapsed, the garrison surrendered rather than face assault. James accepted their submission with magnanimity, allowing the defenders to march free. It was a mistake he would repeat. Etal Castle lasted 2 days. Ford Castle fell without serious resistance. Wark Castle's defenders fled before the Scottish guns could even deploy. In less than 2 weeks, James had done what generations of Scottish kings had failed to accomplish. he had broken English power on the eastern border. The army swelled with confidence. Men who had marched south with uncertainty now strutted through captured English halls, drinking English wine, taking English goods. The camp followers multiplied. Women, merchants, opportunists drawn by the smell of easy plunder. Discipline frayed at the edges. James established his headquarters at Ford Castle, and here the chroniclers pause, embarrassed, to record what tradition insists happened next. Lady Heron, mistress of Ford, was a woman of notable beauty and uncertain loyalty. Her husband was held prisoner in Scotland. Her situation demanded flexibility. According to accounts that may be more legend than history, she entertained the Scottish king personally. Very personally. James lingered at Ford longer than strategy demanded. Some say days, some say a week. While his army's supplies dwindled and English forces gathered, historians still debate whether the Heron affair actually delayed the campaign or merely provided a convenient excuse for those seeking to explain what came next. What matters is simpler. James had achieved his initial objectives and now faced a choice that would determine everything. He could advance deeper into England, threatening York itself. He could retreat to Scotland, having accomplished more than any Scottish king in memory. He could hold his position and wait for the English response. James chose to wait, and waiting, in September, on the wrong side of the border, with 30,000 men requiring daily mountains of food, was a decision that could only end one way. The army began to bleed, not from English action, Surrey's forces were still days away, but from the simple reality of medieval logistics. Men who had marched south expecting a quick campaign found themselves shivering in English rain, eating food they had to forage from already stripped countryside. The Highland contingents grew restless. This was not the warfare they understood, this waiting. Several clans simply left, melting northward with whatever plunder they could carry. James watched his magnificent army shrink. 5,000 gone in the first week of waiting, perhaps more. The precise numbers vanished into the rain, and the chaos of a host slowly losing cohesion. Still he waited. The king had received word that Surrey was approaching with an English army. Good. This was what he wanted. Not mere castle-taking, not border raiding, but a proper battle. The kind that settled things, that proved who was the better king, the better warrior, the better man. James had spent his entire reign preparing for this moment. He would not retreat now. He moved his army to Flodden Edge. The position was magnificent. A steep ridge overlooking the English approach, the slopes turned to mud by autumn rains. Artillery dominated the approaches. Any attacker would have to climb uphill into Scottish guns, then face the massed pikes at the summit. Surrey would either break himself against the position or refuse battle and retreat in shame. James looked down from his ridge and felt, perhaps for the first time since crossing the border, genuine satisfaction. He had done everything right. He had brought an overwhelming force, captured strategic objectives, and now occupied an unassailable position. The English had no choice but to fight on his terms or flee. On the ridge, the rain continued to fall. The mud deepened. The guns sank into their emplacements, and somewhere to the south, an old man was about to teach the King of Scotland that positions mean nothing if your enemy refuses to attack them. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, should have been dead. He was 70 years old, ancient by the standards of his age, and his body had been failing for years. Gout had swollen his joints until walking became agony. His digestion had collapsed. He survived on broths and wine when he could eat at all. The journey north had nearly killed him, each mile a fresh negotiation with pain that would have left younger men bedridden. But Thomas Howard was not a younger man. He was something more dangerous, a survivor. He had survived the Wars of the Roses, backing the wrong king and somehow emerging with his head. He had survived Richard III's fall at Bosworth, spending 3 years in the Tower while Henry VII decided whether to execute him. He had survived the slow rebuilding of his family's fortunes, clawing back lands and titles one royal favour at a time. His eldest son had married the old king's daughter-in-law. The Howards were now bound to the Tudors by blood. When Henry VIII crossed the Channel, he left his kingdom's defence to this broken old man and his sons. The king expected no trouble. Surrey knew better. The message about the Scottish invasion reached him on September the 3rd. By September 4th, he was riding north, gathering every soldier he could find. The commission of array went out to every northern lord. "Bring your men, bring your weapons, come now, not tomorrow, now." The response was gratifying and insufficient. The North had already sent its best soldiers to France with the king. What remained were second sons, elderly retainers, town militias with more enthusiasm than training. Surrey counted his forces and found perhaps 26,000, already outnumbered by the Scots and with none of the enemy's artillery advantage. Historians still debate whether Surrey's strategy emerged fully formed or developed in response to circumstances. What is clear is that the old man understood one thing James did not. A defensive position is only valuable if your enemy attacks it. Surrey had no intention of climbing Flodden Edge. He sent a herald to the Scottish camp. The message was carefully calibrated. An old lord, offended by foreign invasion, challenged the Scottish king to meet him in honourable battle. Not a siege, not a standoff, a proper engagement, army against army on Friday the 9th of September. Would His Majesty condescend to fight? James received the challenge with pleasure. This was the chivalric warfare he understood. Formal, honourable, decisive. He agreed to the terms. What he did not realise was that he had agreed to nothing at all. Surrey's challenge contained no specifics about location, approach, or tactics. The old man had purchased time and information while committing to nothing. On September 8th, Surrey began his march, not toward Flodden Edge, around it. The English army moved north and east, circling the Scottish position through rain that turned roads to rivers. Men slogged through mud that pulled boots from feet and sucked at wagon wheels. The supply train fell behind. Food ran out. Surrey's soldiers advanced on empty stomachs, cursing their commanders, wondering why they were marching away from the enemy. Surrey did not explain. He did not need to. His sons, Thomas Howard the Younger, Edmund Howard, the other commanders, understood what he intended. If the Scots would not come down from their ridge, the English would get behind them, cut their line of retreat, force them to fight on ground of English choosing or flee to Scotland through an English army. It was not chivalric, it was not honourable. It was the reasoning of a man who had survived 50 years of English politics by understanding that survival mattered more than reputation. The Scottish Scouts reported the English movement. James faced another choice. He could stay on Flodden Edge, trusting that Surrey's flanking march would exhaust his army before it achieved position. He could retreat to Scotland, preserving his army but abandoning his honour. Or he could move to intercept, abandoning his perfect defensive position but maintaining the initiative. James chose to move. He ordered his army to the lower ridge at Branxton, facing north instead of south. The guns were repositioned, the pike formations reformed, and in doing so he gave up the only advantage that might have saved him. The trap was closing. The old man of Surrey had done what seemed impossible. He had manoeuvred a warrior king off his unassailable position, using nothing but patience, deception, and the oldest weapon in military history: pride. The morning of September 9th, 1513, dawned grey and cold. James stood on Branxton Hill, watching the English emerge from the mist below. His new position was still formidable. The slope was steep, the ground was muddy, his guns had clear fields of fire. He had repositioned his army in good order, and if the new ground was not as perfect as Flodden Edge, it remained defensible. What he could not see, what no one standing on that hill could see, was what lay between his army and the English lines. The ground at the base of Branxton Hill appeared to be a gentle slope of autumn grass. In reality, it was a death trap. The incessant rain of the past week had transformed the low ground into a bog hidden beneath deceptively solid-looking vegetation. Worse, a small stream called the Palin's Burn had overflowed its banks, creating channels of standing water invisible from above. The footing that looked manageable from the hilltop would, in practice, swallow men to their thighs. James had scouted his position from the heights. He had not walked it from below. Surrey had. The English army deployed in 4 divisions or battles across the northern approaches. The old Earl commanded the rear. His son Thomas the Younger led the vanguard. Edmund Howard, the youngest son, held the right flank with a force heavy in local levies and light in experience. Lord Dacre's border horsemen waited in reserve, ready to exploit any opportunity. The Scottish deployment mirrored the English, but with a critical difference. James had organised his forces in the continental fashion, dense columns of pikemen, each bristling with 18-foot spears, designed to crush enemy formations through sheer mass and forward momentum. This was the tactic that had made the Swiss infantry feared throughout Europe. It was devastatingly effective on firm ground. It was suicide in mud. Historians still debate whether James received warnings about the terrain. Some accounts suggest that experienced border lords, men who knew this land in all seasons, urged caution. If so, the king ignored them. His eyes were fixed on the English formations below, smaller than his own army, positioned with their backs to Scotland, apparently trapped between the Scottish force and foreign soil. The guns spoke first. Scottish artillery opened fire around 4 in the afternoon. The great cannon that James had spent decades accumulating now proved their worth, and their weakness. The balls crashed into English ranks with devastating effect. Men burst apart, formations scattered. The sound alone was enough to shake courage, but the English guns answered. And here a terrible irony emerged. The Scottish artillery was technically superior, larger guns, more numerous, better supplied. But the English gunners were more skilled. While Scottish shot flew high, arcing over English heads into empty ground, English fire struck home again and again. One chronicler recorded that Scottish gun crews were massacred at their positions, unable to depress their barrels far enough to hit enemies on lower ground. The artillery duel lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When it ended, the Scottish guns were largely silent, their crews dead or fled. English cannon continued to fire into the massed pike columns on the hill. James could not tolerate this. The king had not marched 30,000 men across the border to stand on a hill and be shot to pieces. He had not spent his reign becoming a warrior to watch his soldiers die without answering. The English were below, exposed, waiting. Every minute of delay cost Scottish lives for nothing. He gave the order. The pike columns began to move. First the Earl of Holmes' division on the left, then Errol and Crawford in the centre left, then the king's own division in the centre right. They advanced in good order, pikes levelled, thousands of men moving as a single organism down the slope toward the enemy. From the hilltop it looked magnificent. From ground level it was the beginning of a massacre. The first ranks hit the bog and stumbled. Men went down, tangled in unseen roots, trapped in mud that grabbed at ankles and refused to release. The tight formations, essential for pike warfare, began to separate. Soldiers who had trained to fight shoulder to shoulder found themselves isolated, struggling simply to stay upright. And they had not yet reached the English. The distance that should have taken minutes stretched into an eternity of floundering. Pikes dropped as men used their hands to pull themselves through the mire. The disciplined advance became a ragged stumble. By the time the Scottish columns reached the English lines, they were exhausted, disordered, and about to discover that their weapons had become death sentences. The first collision shattered expectations on both sides. Holmes' Scots on the left flank struck Edmund Howard's division with terrifying force. Despite the mud, despite the chaos of the advance, the Scottish left retained enough cohesion to slam into the English right like a wave against a sandcastle. Edmund's men, many of them local levies with little training, broke almost immediately. The young Howard went down, his standard falling, his bodyguard cut apart around him. For a moment it seemed the battle would end in Scottish triumph. Holmes' borderers poured through the gap, whooping their war cries, slaughtering the fleeing English with professional efficiency. The right wing of Surrey's army simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. Bodies carpeted the ground, English bodies dying in the mud they had expected their enemies to die in. Then Holmes stopped. Historians still debate whether what happened next was treachery, tactical sense, or simple human nature. Holmes' men had broken the English right, but rather than wheel inward to roll up the English centre, they fell upon the baggage train. Plunder, the eternal temptation of medieval armies, proved stronger than strategy. Horses, supplies, valuables. The borderers had not ridden south for glory, they had come for profit. Lord Dacre's reserve cavalry, which should have been annihilated in the rout, found itself facing an enemy more interested in stealing than fighting. Dacre rallied his horsemen and charged the scattered looters, driving them back. Holmes' division, which had won the battle's first phase decisively, effectively removed itself from the remainder of the engagement. The Scottish left had triumphed. The Scottish left had become irrelevant. In the centre, catastrophe was unfolding. The pike formations that had looked so formidable on Branxton Hill became death traps at its base. The 18-foot spears, designed for tight formations on level ground, proved almost unusable in the churned mud. Men could not plant their feet firmly enough to brace against contact. They could not manoeuvre the unwieldy weapons quickly enough to defend against faster opponents. The front ranks, packed so tightly that they could barely breathe, found themselves unable to lower their pikes to fighting level. And the English had bills. The bill was an ugly weapon, 8 feet of wooden shaft topped by a hook-bladed head that could pull, cut, and thrust. It lacked the pike's reach, but excelled at close quarters, exactly the kind of fighting that the bog-churned ground now forced. English billmen ducked under the waving pike points and went to work. The sound was unlike anything in normal warfare. Not the ring of blade on blade, but the wet crunch of metal finding flesh. The crack of pike shafts snapping. The screaming that seemed to have no end. Men in the front ranks died standing, held upright by the press of bodies behind them. Men in the middle ranks pushed forward into a wall of corpses, unable to see what was killing their comrades, unable to stop their momentum. Men in the rear heard the screaming and could do nothing. The mud claimed as many as the bills. Men went down and could not rise. Boots stuck fast, knees sank. Hands grasping for purchase found only the cold slick of blood-soaked earth. The fallen drowned in inches of water, or suffocated under the weight of bodies falling atop them, or simply lay helpless until an English bill found their throats. The centre divisions, Crawford, Errol, Montrose, drove into this charnel house with all the courage that Scottish chivalry demanded. It meant nothing. Courage does not drain a swamp. Courage does not lengthen a weapon's reach. Courage does not resurrect the dead. Crawford fell, his standard going down in a chaos of mud and blood. Errol fell, still pushing forward, still trying to reach enemies he could not touch. Montrose fell, his household cut down around him, the flower of Scottish nobility dying in a hollow they could not escape. And still, James had not committed his own division. The king stood on the lower slope watching his army die and faced the last decision of his reign. He could retreat, pull his fresh division back, preserve what remained, fight another day. He could manoeuvre, seek better ground, wait for home to rejoin, refuse the killing field. He could be his father. James IV drew his sword. The royal banner moved forward. Behind it, the king's household and the finest warriors Scotland possessed began their descent into hell. The king's division struck the English centre like a thunderbolt hurled into a wall. James led from the front as he had always led, as he believed a true king must lead. His household knights formed a wedge around him, men who had trained together for decades, who had competed in his tournaments, who had drunk his wine and shared his ambitions. They were the best Scotland had. They died first. The geometry of slaughter was simple and merciless. An 18-foot pike requires space. Space to lower, space to thrust, space to recover. In the press of the melee, space ceased to exist. Scottish pikemen found themselves chest to chest with English billmen, their weapons useless lumber extending behind them into the mass of their own comrades. They could not swing. They could not thrust. They could not retreat. They could only stand and be carved apart by men with shorter, faster, more brutal tools. The English bill was designed for exactly this moment. The hook at its head caught armour edges, pike shafts, exposed limbs. A skilled billman could pull a knight off his feet, drag down a pike point, hook the back of a leg and hamstring an armoured man before he understood what was happening. The cutting edge opened throats and severed hands. The spike at the top punched through visors and mail. Close quarters favoured the bill. The mud favoured the bill. Everything favoured the bill. Historians still debate whether the Scottish commanders understood before the battle how their weapons would fail them. The pike phalanx had dominated European warfare for a generation. The Swiss victories were famous, their tactics studied and imitated. But the Swiss fought on alpine meadows, on the hard-packed roads of Italy, on ground that let men plant their feet and push. No one had tested the pike system in a September bog against an enemy designed to exploit its weaknesses. The lesson was written in blood across Branxton Field. James pushed deeper into the English mass. His armour turned blows. His sword found English flesh. His strength and skill kept him alive when men around him fell. But strength and skill cannot overcome mathematics. For every Englishman he cut down, 2 more appeared. For every step forward, his men died by the dozen. The royal standard lurched and stumbled as its bearers were killed and replaced, the cycle repeating until no one remained to hold it. The king's progress towards Surrey's position became the stuff of legend and the instrument of catastrophe, because James would not stop, would not retreat, would not do the sensible thing and preserve what remained of his army. He was perhaps 50 yards from Surrey when the press became too thick to move. The royal division had penetrated the English centre, but penetration without breakthrough meant nothing except casualties. They were surrounded now, or nearly so, English bills working the flanks while more poured in from the front. The mud turned red, then brown, then black with the sludge of churned earth and blood and the contents of opened bellies. The smell was beyond description. Copper and iron and the sewer stink of perforated bowels. Men vomited and fought. Men wept and fought. Men screamed prayers and curses and the names of saints, and still they fought, because there was nothing else to do. Thomas Howard the Younger drove his division into the melee, reinforcing his father's position, grinding against the Scottish advance. Fresh English soldiers met exhausted Scots, and the outcome was inevitable. The Scottish push stalled, then reversed, then became a killing. James's household died around him, not in some heroic last stand. There was no drama, no flourish, no speeches. They simply went down, one by one, pulled into the mud by billhooks, skulls crushed by staff blows, throats opened by short, savage cuts. The king fought on. An arrow struck his jaw, the head lodging deep. A bill blade took his left hand, the gauntlet collapsing around ruined bones. Still he fought. The irony was absolute. James IV had spent his entire reign becoming the warrior king Scotland needed. He had achieved it. He was magnificent in these final moments, brave beyond measure, skilled beyond complaint, committed beyond reason. It meant nothing. Courage is not a tactic. Commitment is not a strategy. The finest sword arm in Scotland could not overcome 18,000 English bills, could not drain a swamp, could not undo the decision that had brought this army to this place. The king's body would be found within a lance length of where Surrey had stood. So close, so utterly, meaninglessly close. The end came in pieces. James IV did not fall in some climactic moment, no dramatic last stroke, no final words preserved for posterity. He was simply reduced. Each minute brought new wounds. Each wound slowed him. Each slowing invited more blows. The process had all the grandeur of butchering livestock. Witnesses, those who survived, remembered fragments. The king's left hand hanging useless, blood sheeting from beneath his helmet. The strange persistence of his sword arm still swinging, still cutting, even as his body failed around the weapon. An arrow protruded from his neck, or his jaw, or both. Accounts differ, and the chaos of the melee made certainty impossible. What is certain is that an English bill found the gap beneath his arm, the vulnerable joint where armour plates met, and the blow sent the king to his knees. He rose. God help him, he rose. James IV, King of Scotland, rose from his knees in the mud of an English field and tried to continue forward. He made perhaps 3 steps. The bills came in from all sides then, no longer fighting a king, just finishing a man. The blows were working strokes, efficient, professional. They found the seams, the joints, the places where steel could reach flesh. The king's armour, state-of-the-art protection that had cost a fortune, became a cage for his dying. When he finally fell, no one announced it. No trumpet sounded the Scottish loss. The battle simply continued grinding forward, English bills against Scottish pikes, mud and blood, and the endless sounds of metal meeting flesh. Somewhere in the press, a body in royal armour settled into the muck, and the fighting rolled over it like a tide over a stone. Historians still debate the exact moment of James's death. Some chronicles place it near the battle's end. Others suggest he fell earlier, his death hidden by the chaos around him. The truth may be simpler and more terrible. It didn't matter. The Scottish army was dying regardless. The king's survival would not have changed the outcome by the time he fell. The slaughter continued until darkness made killing impossible. The Scottish right wing, which had not yet engaged, finally advanced in the fading light. Argyll and Lennox led their Highlanders down the slope, seeking to relieve pressure on the shattered centre. They ran into the same nightmare that had consumed their countrymen, mud that clutched, pikes that could not function, bills that worked with terrible efficiency. Argyll died, Lennox died, their clansmen died around them. When night fell, the English held the field, but held implies control that did not exist. The battlefield was a maze of bodies and mud, of wounded men crying in languages their enemies did not speak, of dying horses thrashing in the mire. No one knew who had won, no one knew who had lost. They only knew that the killing had stopped because darkness made it impossible to continue. Surrey's men collapsed where they stood. They had marched for days without adequate food. They had fought for hours in conditions that defied endurance. Many had lost their weapons, their comrades, their sense of what they had accomplished. They slept in the rain, among the dead, waiting for dawn to reveal the truth. The Scottish survivors, those who could still walk, stumbled northward through the night. They left behind their guns, their supplies, their wounded. They left behind their king, though they did not yet know it. They left behind the greatest army Scotland had ever fielded, scattered across a muddy hillside like broken toys. The rain continued to fall. It fell on English soldiers sleeping in their armour. It fell on Scottish wounded who would not survive until morning. It fell on a body wearing royal armour, lying face down in the mud, close enough to the English command position that Surrey's men would stumble upon it at first light. The water pooled in the hollows of the dead king's armour. It mixed with the blood still seeping from wounds beyond counting. It washed away nothing. The mud was too thick, the carnage too complete for any rain to clean. On Branxton Hill, perhaps 12,000 Scottish soldiers lay dead or dying. Among them were an archbishop, 2 bishops, 2 abbots, 12 earls, 14 lords of parliament, and the king himself. Scotland's golden age had lasted 25 years. Its end had taken an afternoon. Dawn revealed the mathematics of catastrophe. Surrey's men picked through the field as the September sun struggled through dissipating clouds. What they found defied comprehension. Bodies lay 3 and 4 deep in places where the fighting had been thickest. The mud had preserved them in attitudes of violence, arms raised to ward off blows, hands still gripping useless pike shafts, faces frozen in expressions that would haunt survivors for decades. The English counted their own dead first. Perhaps 1,500 had fallen, a significant loss, but survivable. Then they began counting the Scots. The numbers climbed through the morning. 5,000, 8,000, 10,000. The final tally would take days to establish, and even then remained uncertain. Somewhere between 10 and 17,000 Scottish soldiers had died on Branxton Field, depending on whose estimates one trusted. The higher figure included those who drowned fleeing through swollen rivers, who died of wounds in the following days, who simply disappeared into the chaos of defeat and were never seen again. Among the dead lay the governance of Scotland. The search for the king's body had begun at first light. Surrey needed confirmation, needed to know whether this had been a victory or merely a successful battle. His men found the royal corpse around mid-morning, lying within feet of where the old earl had commanded. James had come so close to his target that, had he reached it, had he killed Surrey himself, the English army might have broken. But might have is not history. History is a body in the mud, stripped of its armour, identified by its wounds. The king's corpse bore at least 9 mortal injuries. The left hand was destroyed, bones shattered where a bill had crushed the gauntlet. An arrow shaft protruded from the lower jaw, the head lodged somewhere in the throat or neck. A deep puncture wound beneath the right arm suggested the blow that had finally brought him down. Various cuts, slashes and contusions marked arms, legs and torso, the accumulated damage of fighting too long against too many. Historians still debate whether James died from any single wound or from the cumulative effect of many. The question is academic. He died. He died attacking. He died doing exactly what he believed a king should do. He died accomplishing nothing except his own destruction. Surrey had the body stripped, examined and preserved in lead for transport to England. The old Earl then composed a letter to Henry VIII, still in France, informing the king that his brother-in-law was dead and Scotland's power was broken. The message was formal, military, stripped of emotion. It did not mention the iron chain that searchers found wrapped around the dead king's waist. The penance he had worn for 25 years, the weight he had carried to his grave. The chain went to England with the body. It has never been seen since. The battlefield itself became a charnel house that defied clean-up. Bodies were too numerous to bury properly. Mass graves swallowed most of the dead, Scottish and English together, rank and station meaning nothing in the pits. Local farmers would find bones for centuries, ploughing up skulls and armour fragments and the corroded remains of weapons. The surviving Scottish nobles faced the longest walk of their lives. Those who had escaped, a handful of earls, some border lords who had fled with Holmes' division, various knights and gentlemen who had somehow avoided the killing ground, had to carry news northward. They had to explain how the largest army in Scottish history had been destroyed in an afternoon. They had to tell widows that their husbands were dead. They had to tell a nation that its king was gone. The task of informing Queen Margaret fell to whoever reached Edinburgh first. History does not record who brought her the news, or how she received it. She was 23 years old. Her husband was dead. Her son, James V, was 17 months old. She was now the regent of a broken kingdom, the English princess who had married the Scottish king, suddenly responsible for a nation that had just lost everything. The irony was perfect and terrible. Margaret Tudor was the sister of the man who had caused this war. Henry VIII's continental ambitions had drawn Scotland into conflict. Henry's refusal to negotiate had forced James's hand, and now Henry's sister would rule what remained of Scotland, guardian of a child king surrounded by nobles who had lost fathers and brothers and sons on an English field. The system required it. The system did not care about irony. The news travelled faster than the survivors. It moved by rumour first, whispers exchanged on roads, fragments overheard in taverns, the slow accumulation of dread that preceded any official announcement. By the time the first confirmed reports reached Edinburgh, the city already knew, not the details, those would come later, but the essential, terrible truth. The army was destroyed. The king was dead. Scotland had lost. Edinburgh went quiet in a way that unnerved those who remembered it. The city that had sent its men south with such confidence, that had celebrated the departure of the greatest host Scotland had ever assembled, fell into a silence broken only by the sounds of grief. The women were the first to truly understand. In every cottage and manor, in Edinburgh's closes and the farming communities of the borders, women who had watched their men march away now faced the arithmetic of catastrophe. Husbands, sons, brothers, fathers. The flower of Scottish manhood had not merely been defeated, it had been harvested. There was hardly a family of any rank that had not lost someone. The term Flodden generation would come later, applied by historians to the children who grew up without fathers, the women who never remarried, the communities that never fully recovered. But the experience began that September week, in the slow comprehension of what absence meant. There were no bodies to bury. Most of the dead lay in English soil, in mass graves they would never leave. The traditional rites of mourning, the viewing, the funeral, the placement of remains in family ground were impossible. Women grieved for men they would never see again, dead or alive. The uncertainty itself became a wound that never healed. Historians still debate the exact demographic impact of Flodden. The highest estimates suggest that 1 in 3 adult Scottish males of military age died that day. The lowest estimates are still devastating. Enough dead to create labour shortages, to leave fields unploughed, to force widows into arrangements of desperation. And the political crisis compounded everything. James V was 17 months old. The kingdom required a regent. Queen Margaret, by her husband's will, should have assumed that role, but Margaret was English, sister to the enemy king, suspect in ways that no amount of grief could erase. The Scottish nobility, what remained of it, divided immediately between those who supported the Queen and those who sought alternatives. The Duke of Albany emerged as the most viable challenger. He was James IV's cousin, raised in France, barely Scottish in anything but blood, but he was male, he was adult, and he was not English. The faction that supported him argued that Scotland needed strong leadership, not a mourning queen and her infant son. What followed was not quite civil war, but it was not peace either. The factionalism that James IV had spent his reign suppressing exploded in the vacuum of his death. Lords who had stood together at Flodden now manoeuvred against each other for position. The unity that had produced the Great Army dissolved into the familiar Scottish pattern of clan rivalry and aristocratic ambition. Queen Margaret, caught between her English birth and her Scottish duty, made choices that pleased no one. She remarried within a year to Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, and the marriage cost her the regency. Albany arrived from France and assumed control of a kingdom that could not decide whether he was its saviour or its captor. The infant king became a prize to be controlled rather than a sovereign to be served. He would spend his childhood as a pawn in adult games, his education shaped by whatever faction held him, his understanding of kingship formed by the memory of a father he could not remember, and a battle that had destroyed everything the father built. England, meanwhile, discovered that victory had solved nothing. Henry VIII returned from France to learn that his brother-in-law was dead, and his sister was now the unhappy centre of Scottish politics. The strategic situation had not fundamentally changed. Scotland remained hostile. France remained allied with Scotland. The northern border remained a problem that would require management. The body of James IV remained in England, unburied. Henry could not quite decide what to do with his dead enemy. The corpse was eventually taken to the monastery of Sheen, near Richmond, where it lay in a lead coffin for years. When the monastery was dissolved during the Reformation, workers reportedly found the body remarkably preserved. The embalming had been thorough, and treated it as a curiosity rather than the remains of a king. A later account claims that workmen cut off the head, and that it eventually ended up in the possession of Elizabeth I's master glazier, who used it as a pot for storing nails before finally burying it in a London churchyard. The story may be apocryphal. If true, it represents the final indignity of a king who had devoted his life to honour. The lament began as whisper and grew into tradition. The flowers of the forest would become Scotland's memorial to Flodden, a melody of such sorrow that it could only be played at funerals and remembrances, too painful for ordinary occasions. The flowers of the forest, the song declared, were all wed away, cut down, harvested, gone. The metaphor was literal. Scotland had sent the finest of a generation to an English field and received nothing back but news of death. The forest, the kingdom, the community, the web of relationships that held a society together had been stripped of its flowers. The song would outlast everything else. It would outlast the political chaos that followed. It would outlast the regencies and the factionalism and the eventual reign of James V. It would outlast the union of crowns that brought James VI to the English throne. It would be played at state funerals 5 centuries later, its melody unchanged, its grief undimmed. Scotland survived Flodden. This requires emphasis. The nation did not collapse, did not submit, did not become an English province. The recovery was slow and painful and incomplete, but it happened. Within a generation, Scotland had rebuilt its military capacity, its political institutions, its sense of itself as a sovereign kingdom. But something had changed. Historians still debate whether Flodden marked a genuine turning point in Scottish history, or simply accelerated trends already underway. The argument can be made either way. What cannot be argued is that the Scotland which emerged from the disaster was different from the Scotland that had entered it. The confidence was gone. James IV's reign had represented something rare, a genuine belief that Scotland could stand as an equal among European powers. The great Michael, the diplomatic triumphs, the cultural flourishing, all had suggested a nation on the rise, capable of challenging England, capable of shaping its own destiny. Flodden shattered that belief. The generation that followed was defensive where their fathers had been ambitious. They looked for allies rather than seeking to stand alone. They cultivated the French connection not as equals but as dependents, junior partners in an alliance that served French interests more than Scottish ones. The dream of parity with England became a fantasy indulged only by poets. The immediate aftermath was worse. The infant James V became a pawn in struggles that had nothing to do with Scotland's welfare. Queen Margaret's remarriage, Albany's regency, the endless manoeuvring of noble factions, all were symptoms of a system that had lost its centre. James IV, for all his flaws, had been the force that held Scotland together. Without him, the centrifugal tendencies that had plagued Scottish politics for generations reasserted themselves. The young king grew up amid this chaos. By the time he assumed personal rule in his late teens, James V had learned lessons his father never taught. Trust no one, rely on no one, expect betrayal from every direction. He became a harder king than his father had been, more suspicious, more ruthless, more willing to destroy those who threatened him. When James V died in 1542, at 30 years old, broken by military defeat and personal grief, he left Scotland with another infant monarch. His daughter Mary was 6 days old when she became queen. The pattern had become familiar. A king dies, a child inherits, regencies follow, with all their factional chaos. The kingdom survives, but only barely. And at the root of it all lay Flodden. The battle's influence extended beyond politics into the realm of memory. Scots came to see Flodden as a defining moment, not a beginning or an end, but a demonstration of something essential about their relationship with England. They could fight, they could sacrifice, they could send their finest to die for honour and independence, and England would survive, would recover, would remain the larger power against which Scotland had to measure itself. The tragedy was complete not because Scotland lost a battle, but because winning would not have changed this fundamental reality. Even if James IV had reached Surrey, had killed the old Earl, had broken the English army and marched on York, England would have recovered. England would have returned. The disparity in population, wealth, and strategic position was too great to overcome with any single victory. James IV did not understand this. He believed that courage and will could compensate for mathematics. He believed that being a better king, a braver warrior, a more honourable man would matter in the final accounting. He was wrong. The English system absorbed the Howard success and continued. It would absorb future defeats and continue. It was larger than any individual, stronger than any victory, more durable than any dynasty. Scotland was fighting not a kingdom, but an inevitability. James IV died less than a pike's length from the enemy commander. He died doing everything he believed a king should do. He died magnificently. It meant nothing. The chain they found around his waist had grown heavy over 25 years, link added to link, the weight of his father's blood accumulating with every passing month. He had worn it as penance, as a reminder, as the physical manifestation of the guilt that drove his entire reign. On Branxton Field, the chain finally came off, but not through absolution, not through redemption, not through any act of divine grace. It came off because English soldiers stripped his body looking for valuables, and they took everything. The crown he wore, the armour that protected him, the chain he had carried for a quarter century, and then they threw the body in a lead box and shipped it south, where it would wait decades for a burial that may never have come. James IV, King of Scotland, died September 9th, 1513. The kingdom he built survived. The men he led went home in fragments, those who went home at all. And the song they sing for him even now remembers only the grief, not the folly. The flowers of the forest are all weed away. The empire endured, the man did not.